Sun. Hanlin Sun is the Wing Research Fellow at Nordita, so Stockholm University, very close to KTH and also KTH. And he's interested in the dynamic processes on networks and the higher order network, inference and optimization on networks, as well as the interdisciplinary area between network science and quantum theory.
Is there this controller?
Sorry?
Is a controller of the slides overhead too? Yeah.
No, it's no, yeah, we don't have a.
Okay. Okay. First, thanks to the organizer to put together such a workshop. And I think my talk might be a little bit different from the others in the sense that I'm working on a theoretical model, motivated or inspired by neuroscience, but may not perfectly fit into the realistic brain network model. And this is actually the first time I give this talk to neuroscientists. Previously, I have given this talk to like physicists or network scientists, so maybe your perspective is slightly different. And I do want to hear what do you think, if anything makes sense in this work. So this talk, the title of this talk is Triadic percolation induces dynamical topological patterns in higher order network. The title may not make any sense to you right now, but I will try to break it down to explain to you. So previously, the network model has been used quite widely to describe the complex system and by encoding the pairwise interaction between nodes into the network. But recently, people noticed that the pairwise network, the pairwise interaction may not be sufficient to capture all this complicated type of interaction. So higher order networks models are proposed. There are some examples, for example, hypergraphs, simplicial complexes. And these are like two mainly used and discussed ones. And they have been very widely applied to many problems, for example, the epidemic modeling, and for example, also in brain network. And also some theoretical advance has been made on this framework. For example, the synchronization on higher order network display some novel critical phenomena. And however, these two models, I mean, there are another general type of interaction may not be well captured in this model, which is called triadic interaction. And here I'm showing two examples. And the first one is in the brain network. The glia is manipulating the synaptic interaction between two neurons. So the glia can either enhance or inhibit the interaction between two neurons. And the second example is an ecological network, that the existence of a third species could affect interaction between two other species. So basically a third node, a third person is interacting the relationship between two other. So this is two examples, and there might be more examples in, for example, the biochemical reaction networks, or even in climate networks. So it's quite general. And it seems there are also some possible evidence of in the brain that some regions may have this kind of triadic interaction, in the sense that one region is active in the same time, the other two regions might be deactivated. So they imply the possibility of such a triadic interaction. So this interaction as a general type of interaction in nature, but this only had been studied in small ecological systems. And so this is one motivation that we want to study this type of interaction in a more general network framework. And the other motivation related to percolation. So usually we use percolation theory to capture the network activity. The assumption that's commonly accepted is that only node in the giant connected cluster is active. And so in traditionally in the percolation theory, we have a network and we calculate, let's say we count the nodes which are in the giant component, which are not, and we get the size of the giant component, so we can estimate the network activity. So in these traditional cases, the network topology is fixed. And in the end, you get a stable or static fraction of node in the giant component, that's it. But in many real systems, for example, in brain, the network activity changes in time. And we don't know if percolation theory could also capture such changes. So in this work, we propose a theoretical model that's trying to give an answer to both questions. We propose a higher order network model. We call it network with triadic interaction, and we study the effect of the triadic interaction in shaping the macroscopic network property. So before we start explaining this this model, I would like to bring a little bit preparation of percolation theory on network, just in case you may not familiar with this. The idea is very simple. The percolation theory is used to evaluate the robustness of a network under some random removal of links or nodes. And the general assumption is that node in the giant component, by giant component, we mean the largest and extensive connected component. So the largest size is comparable to the system size. And if there is a giant component, usually indicates the network still functioning. If there's no giant component, usually means the network stopped functioning. So we can tell by setting the percolation or the threshold to tell when the network failed. So here is a simple example. We have a network, and the blue ones are in the giant component, and the green ones are not in the giant component. So when we randomly remove some links, then the network topology changes. The size of the giant component also changes. So now you're resulting in a smaller giant component. So we can capture this by theory. So we consider infinite, so network size in the infinite limit. And we remove node or links with a probability. We call it Q here. Or in other words, we retain the links with a probability P. And we check the order parameter R, which is defined as a fraction of node in the giant component. And we find there's a phase transition. So below the threshold, R equals to 0. So meaning the network is stopped functioning. And above the threshold, the network have a non-zero R value. So the network still functioning. And the transition is continuous here on this simple pairwise networks. And yeah, so now we could try to introduce this framework of triadic percolation. So we try to encode this triadic interaction into the normal network. So here is a model we propose. So this is a higher order network model formed by structural connectivities and the regulatory connectivities. So basically on a simple network, on the top of a simple network, we add this triadic regulatory interaction from nodes to links. So you see this black, like the red square are structural links, and this green and red dashed lines are regulations. And this regulation can be either positive or negative. So this, like in the brain, the glia can either inhibit or support the interaction between neurons. And so here we consider a very simple rules of activation. So we assume that an active link requires at least one active positive regulator and no active negative regulator. So, and then the third property we consider is the link percolation. So the links are deactivated due to the regulation or some random damage. So in the end, the network links are deactivated with a certain probability. So now we can study the percolation on this framework, and we find that this triadic interaction turns percolation into a fully dynamical process. That's interesting because previously percolation usually a static process that you remove the links and the network topology is fixed. So the giant component size is also fixed. But here it could be dynamical. So the dynamics you can understand in a simple iterative algorithm. So we have a network, and the first step we find the giant component, and we assume only node in the giant component are active. This is like the general assumption you consider in the percolation theory. And the second step is you determine which links are active. So only active node, which are node in the giant component, can regulate other links. And due to the previous rules of regulation, the second one, the rules of regulation, you can determine which links are active, which links are not. So here on the right-hand side, I show a simple diagram of this process. So for example,
Is there a difference between PL and P?
Yeah, I'll go to that later. So in this case, for example, at t equals 1, at the first step, you check the giant component. So everyone is in the giant component, so they're all active. And in step 2, you determine which links are deactivated. So this link on the right and on the bottom are deactivated because they are negatively regulated by 2 regulators. And then next step, because these 2 links are broken, so the network topology changes, giant component size changes, and the node in the giant component changes as well. So the link on the left is deactivated because the node that's regulated is not in the giant component anymore. So the process can go on and on. And the interesting thing you see is at time t equals 4, this network status is the same as t equals 2. So you have a periodic oscillation of the network topology. And in this case, I show a deterministic example that, from the t equals 1, you can predict exactly what happened at any time step. But in general, you can consider a stochastic case that after the regulation, the links are removed with probability 1 minus p. So you can understand this as some like a stochastic effect of like every step, some links are randomly deactivated. So previously, in the previous step, this PL, this PL is a combination of effect of this random removal, this P, and this regulation. You can see from the equation later. And so actually, you may notice one thing, that it's a 2-step process. So we do percolation, then we do regulation, and then we do percolation and regulation. So there is assumption inside that, so now we consider a discrete time process. So the application or the assumption of percolation used here can be interpreted in this way. So percolation can describe the terminal state of some spreading process happening on this network. For example, you consider epidemic spreading process on a network, or you consider the epilepsy spreading in a brain network. So it starts from somewhere, and after a while, it's finished. And the percolation tells you when it's finished, how many nodes are affected or infected. So the percolating cluster tells you what happened after the finish of this process, the terminal state of this process. So here the assumption is basically we assume the spreading process on the network is faster than the regulation process, because when we do percolation, we assume this process immediately finished, and then it have then next step it's affected by this regulatory effect from the previous time step. So this is assumption used here. I'm not sure if that really makes sense or not, but in order to solve it analytically, we kind of applied it here. So here I show a rather simple example with only 4 nodes, and you have this period 2 oscillation between between network status. And here I can show a more complicated, still periodic, but more with a longer period process. So here I only show the active node and active links. And we can propose a percolation theory to capture this behavior. This is a mean field type of theory. So we consider the network is the random network ensemble. So we have a collection of a lot of random network with a given degree distribution. Then we average over all of them, and we see what happened. Right? So mean field type model. So it's quite simple in the sense that the first two lines about this S and the R is just percolation equation. exactly the same as standard percolation. The only difference is the third line, this PL. The probability of retaining a link is depending on the regulation as well as this random removal probability or random retaining probability P. And so you can write this kind of a dynamical equation, and it can be actually quite simplified to only a one-dimensional equation. So briefly speaking, the network activity or the fraction of active node at time t is a function of a fraction of node at time t minus 1. So you can iterate it and see what's going on. And theoretically, this question can be like well captured by the theory of dynamic systems or this one-dimensional map study. So you can study the property by using cobweb plot, and you can also predict this phase diagram, fully determine the phase diagram by this set of equation. And you can also analyze the critical point. For example, when you can observe period 2 oscillation, when you have period 3 oscillation, sorry, period 4 oscillation, or when you have steady state, when you have chaos, you can just study the Jacobian of this system. So here is an example of the cobweb plot. So you start from somewhere and you start the iteration. For example, you start from here, this initial condition here, and next step, you find an R by the second equation. Then next step, you find PL, and next step, you find R. And so basically, it's a graphic visualization of your iterative process. And this figure actually tells you this is a period 2 oscillation, because in the end, you see this value of R is jumping between two values. So here I put together the time series and this cobweb plot together. So at t goes, you see the network activity is oscillating between a higher activity and a lower activity. There's a period 2 oscillation in this case. There's some other parameters. This oscillation can be chaotic. And we compare this with, So this is what happened when we change the parameter. So this phenomena can be very rich. It can display a discontinuous transition. You can have period 2 oscillation, you have period 4 oscillation, you have chaotic oscillation, etc. And to compare with the simple percolation on networks, so the Sun percolation is a continuous second-order phase transition, but the Triadic percolation gives you a orbit diagram instead of a simple phase diagram. So this red ones are the numerical calculation from the equation I showed before, and the blue plot is a Monte Carlo simulation on a quenched network. And it's actually going pretty well. So kind of we show that this oscillation is not only a theoretical effect, but you can actually also observe it in simulation. And to make it slightly more convincing, we tried some real networks, real structure networks. So here we consider the mouse brain network, and we add some random regulation on the top of this structure network. And you also observe some chaotic or periodic oscillation. So this suggests that this phenomena is quite universal, that it's not only on some synthetic network, but can also happen on network with more general degree distribution or degree correlation, etc. And in the end, this is a kind of a reduced case that if we only have positive regulators and no negative regulators, we can prove that this dynamic always reach a steady state. And this shows a discontinuous phase transition. So to conclude this first part, so in this work, we show this microscopic effect of triadic interaction on high-order networks. And when we have both positive and negative regulations, the percolation becomes a fully dynamical process, meaning that you have a pure doubling and the route to chaos. And if you only have positive regulations, this percolation always converges to a steady state, and you have a discontinuous phase transition. So that's not the end of story. So at the very beginning, we proposed this whole theory on top of a random network, and that's the only way we can analytically solve it. So that's good on a random network, but in reality, all these networks are not random network, right? So for example, in the brain, or in this city, the road network, or this network in the biological system, they are not random. They're far from random. They usually have a spatial embedding because the connectivity is constrained by the actual physics distance. Right. For example, in brain, you may have more shorter structure connectivities and fewer long connectivities. So this suggests that you should not consider really a random network, but a spatial network. And indeed, that's what we do in the next step. So we're considering the Waxman model. So this is suggesting that the probability of connecting two nodes depends on their distance. In this case, we consider Euclidean distance. The further they are apart, the lower probability to connect them. And the probability we use here is an exponential decay. And so to make our life easier, we put some data points, random point in a two-dimensional square. And then we connect them based on this exponential decay probability. And to avoid this boundary effect, we consider this periodic boundary condition. So it somewhat looks like this. So on the left side, we show the structure connectivity. On the right side, we show the regular connectivity. So the structure connectivity, we connect nodes with probability Pij. And this Pij is exponentially decayed as this Dij, the probability, the distance between node I and node j. And D0 is like a typical length of the connection. And in the regulatory network, we do the same. So the regulation length is also exponentially decayed. So under this framework, we can, of course, study the same thing as we studied in the previous random network model, which is the size of the giant component, the size of activation, no problem. But because this network is embedded in a space, so the size of the activation is not really enough to fully capture the dynamic, the behavior, but also the pattern of the activation. Because the network is in space, the activation might also show a spatial pattern. So we do some simulation, and not clearly, but the percolation theory on spatial network is still, in many cases, an open question. So we don't have a theory to solve it. So we do a lot of simulations. And this is what we see. So the blue, the blue or green, light blue, this color is the inactive node. So this is a node in a square, and the nodes are somewhat large, so they are overlapping together, forming this square. So the green ones are not active, and the purple or pink ones are active. And visually, you can clearly tell there are different spatial patterns. So these are the patterns we obtain and the different parameters. So for example, in the first one, you see it's somewhat small and it's like a cluster. And in the third panel, you see a stripe. And in the middle one is more random or complicated. So that's interesting. We have a lot of questions related to these patterns. For example, how do we classify these patterns? And if these patterns are related to this network parameter, so this is from perspective, what does a pattern looks like, how you distinguish them? And you can also consider the temporal perspective, how these patterns changes in time. Right? What is the dynamic of the patterns? And what is the mechanism responsible for having these patterns? And you can ask more questions. So we try to solve it one by one, how to classify these patterns. And we consider the topological data analysis method. And the motivation is actually, if you see this, in particular, you see the stripes. And the third column, the panel. This is a square with periodic boundary condition. So it's actually a 2D torus. And you have a stripe go across the top, from the top to the bottom, which means it's actually a circle on the torus, right? And in the middle panel, you have this more complicated patterns, but you see that there are kind of stripes across the boundary. So indicating that there might be, on the torus, there might be multiple holes or multiple circles in this pattern. And for this first one, like a little cluster, you may not have really holes on this torus. So that gives us an idea to use the TDA method, because TDA method can naturally tells you when there's a hole, when there's not a hole, right? So this is what we consider. And the idea of, so I guess there will be some expert of TDA in the audience. So I just very briefly explain the idea. So currently you have some data cloud in a space. And around every point, you draw a little ball, a little circle. And you increase the radius of this little ball, and this ball can overlap. When they overlap, you connect these two nodes. So as you increase this R, so you can form a simplicial complex out of this procedure. And in this procedure, you can track the change of the topological feature. For example, at a certain point, you have a hole there, and until a certain point, the hole is closed. And the hole can be one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or higher-dimensional holes. And the good side of this method is that it can tell you, so it's somewhat robust to noise, because if this is a strong, robust topological feature, it should live longer. As you increase this radius, it should be there for quite a long time. So on this barcode, you should have a longer bar. And if the bar is very short, indicating that there might be a noise rather than real feature. So we consider this topological data analysis related method, and we plot this here. So by the way, we name these three patterns: cluster, stripe, and octopus, because they have many legs. And so this persistent diagram encode the information you have in this barcode. So every point tells you that when a topological feature emerges and when it dies. So which means if you have a point very close to diagonal, means that its life expectancy is very short, indicating it might be a noise. If you have some point far away from the diagonal, means it can last for quite a long time. So indicating that it's a feature. And you can somewhat visually tell this persistent diagram for these patterns are somewhat different.
What is H0 and H1?
It's a zero-dimensional topological feature or one-dimensional topological feature. It's not that accurate, but that's the idea. And so we can use a slightly more quantitative way to compare these persistent diagrams, how different they are. For example, how you tell how different the first one is from the second one. So we can calculate the distance between persistent diagrams. There are many different distance measures. So here we consider this Wasserstein distance. So here you can tell that every block is a type of patterns, and you see that actually the distance between persistent diagrams in the same category is mostly smaller than this inter-category distance. So you see that from the top left to the bottom right, this color is lighter, means the distance is smaller, and the cross category patterns usually have a further distance. And so this can provide you a method to distinguish the patterns. If you have a new pattern, you compare with this like a model patterns, and you classify it as the closest one. And here actually you can observe something already. So intra-category distances are smaller than inter-category distance, and octopus pattern in the middle have larger intra-category variability, which means it's a larger distance. And so the classification can be done by calculating this distance. This is one possible approach. And we also try another method that's related to information theory. And this is called permutation entropy and complexity of two-dimensional pattern. So they are defined in this way. So I will try to break it down to you. So this, at the very beginning, this complexity and permutation entropy has been proposed quite early in early 21st century. And they use it on this one-dimensional temporal data to evaluate how complicated or how random this temporal data is. And in this paper in 2018, they generalized it on two-dimensional data. And they use this method to distinguish the painting from different historical era. So the idea is quite simple. You consider you have a lattice, or you have a spatial pattern. That's a different color indicates a different either value. For example, in a painting could mean a different color, and each block is 1 pixel, for example. And you can put a like a little window on this pattern, and you can slide it all over this pattern. So here I consider a 2x2 window, but you can consider a more general x times y window. And you have this window, and you can take this pattern out. So this is one possibility. So blue, green, pink, and black. This is one combination. But obviously, you can have all the other combinations. And you calculate the entropy of these patterns. For example, this very specific pattern, the first line, what is the probability of finding these patterns in all this combination? Sorry, all these possible patterns you extract from this pattern, from this picture. So this entropy tells you how random or how, let's say how random this pattern is. So you can imagine that if this pattern has some sort of a local structure, so for example, the painter like to use the same color locally, and then you should find the lower entropy because you have a quite high probability to have the same pattern sequence. But if this is an entirely random photo or picture, then the entropy should be maximized. So this is one measure, this H entropy. And the second measure, complexity, is related to this entropy, but you code more information, the DPU. The DPU is a measure of distance between a uniform distribution and this PI distribution. So basically it tells you how close it is to purely random pattern. And these two measures are not independent. As you can see from the definition, the C is a function of H, but it's not one-to-one map. So by calculating both H and C, you can actually obtain more information than only calculating one quantity. So thus we calculate this permutation entropy H and the complexity on these patterns. So on this, so here in this violin shape plot, on the left side is a spatial pattern, and the right side is a random pattern to compare with. And the random pattern we generate have the same size of the spatial pattern. So for example, you see that the first panel is this random small cluster. So you have a smaller size, smaller entropy, and smaller complexity. And the octopus have a like relatively medium size, and the entropy comparing with the random pattern is a little bit smaller, but quite high. And the complexity is higher than this random pattern. And in the last panel is these stripes. So the size, average size is somewhat smaller than this octopus pattern, and the complexity is way, the entropy is way less than the random pattern, indicating this is more organized, more structured feature than the octopus, for example. And it has a relatively high complexity comparing to the random pattern. Yeah, so this is a spatial feature. So we quantify how different spatially are they. And we also want to involve the temporal perspective. Like from the temporal perspective, how do they change in time? And we observe some typical temporal behavior. And here we call it short time blinking, indicating that in the most areas, if the node is active at this time step, it's very likely not active at the second step. So you can focus on a certain area. For example, if you look at here, maybe later, if you look at here, you have a blinking, right? So it's on, off type of pattern. Now it's more obvious. Yeah, this is one feature we observed and certain parameters. And the other type, we call it diffusion, is quite different from that, is that here you have a small cluster just randomly move in the space, and you do not have this blinking effect. And you have something nicer that under certain parameters, you can have a very good periodic blinking, which means the size is periodic and also the location are periodic. And to better quantify these, we plot the phase diagram, and this is containing a lot of information. So the x-axis is probability p. So in percolation, we just change this probability p, indicating that we change the level of random failure, or we change the level of stochasticity in this process. And we look at a few quantities of interest. So in this figure, I should explain first that, so for every probability p, we can generate a time trajectory. And these quantities are the average over all the patterns along this time trajectory. So the first figure, this is the size of activation. And this suggests that as p decreases, the R does not decrease monotonically as in simple percolation. So which means that you kind of randomly remove all edges, the more edges, but the network activity can potentially increase because you have negative regulation. So this is quite different from standard percolation. And as p decreases, and you can see a change of the most frequent pattern in the time series. So you can see from the panel C, the panel C is basically the fraction of different patterns. PC is the probability of having a cluster, PO is octopus, PS is the stripes. And you see the change of this ratio. So at very large P, you have almost all stripes. As you decrease probability P, you have more octopus. And when you have a very small P, it's just clusters. And at an intermediate p-value, for example, around 0.6 or 0.7, you see all these patterns coexist. So you don't have a stable spatial pattern, but they can switch from one to another as time goes. So this is, we call it intermittency, and this is kind of example. For example, now is more like stripes, but now it becomes somewhat like an octopus. And there's something more. So we also, so panel B, this is the entropy rate of this time series. And the entropy rate basically describes the predictability of the time series. So in the time series, we consider every time step, we have a pattern, and we classify this pattern. It's either cluster, octopus, or stripes. And then you have a series of this category, right? For example, t equals 1 is a cluster, t equals 2 is octopus, etc., etc. So this entropy rate tells you the long-term behavior, meaning that if you have a very low entropy rate, all the patterns are the same, or they change in the same way. So it's more predictable. If the entropy is large, meaning that the time series is more random, so it's less predictable. This is the idea. So this kind of captures the long time behavior of this temporal change of the pattern. So you can actually see that below roughly 0.4, the entropy rate is almost 0. So because all patterns are clusters, so the time series you only have clusters. So there's basically no change. And when h equals 1, also is very low, the entropy rate, because there's only stripes. And in the middle area, you have a higher entropy rate because you have the coexistence of all different patterns. And that actually there are two local maxima here. So it indicates the most random or most unpredictable time series of patterns. And you can also compare them with this panel C. That's when these three patterns are emerging with somewhat the same probability. For example, around 0.5, you see this three line in the panel C that's intersect together. So they are the same probability of emerging. And around 0.7, you have the two patterns that intersect. So you have a mixture of these two patterns. And the last panel, we consider the return probability. So it's like, what is the probability that the pattern repeat after tau steps? And this is somewhat provide you a short time behavior. For example, if you see this return probability at time t equals to 2 is high, meaning that it's more like a blinking because after every 2 steps, it's go back to the previous one. So here you have large probability for even tau. That's indicating a short time blinking. So every 2 steps go back to the original one. So this has happened at larger p when you observe octopus patterns and stripe patterns. And at the smaller p, you have this lower return probability because you observe clusters. So they kind of don't really go back to where it started. And the second observation is that you increase this tau, the probability decreases. So meaning that these patterns deform at a longer time scale. So in this work, we studied this triadic percolation on spatial networks, and we find that leads to time-varying active components that display topological distinct patterns. And we use the TDA method and the information theory to classify these patterns. And we have found 3 categories: stripes, clusters, and octopus. And they display a very highly non-trivial dynamics. And this observation of spatial and temporal modulations logical of the giant component open a new perspective in the percolation theory, and potentially it can be applied in the study of brain network. And in the end, I want to say one thing that's kind of interesting and somewhat counterintuitive, because if you consider this network structure, when we construct a network, all the nodes are somewhat evenly distributed, uniformly distributed in the square. So every node is surrounded by the same, they live in the same environment, let's say. So network itself is somewhat homogeneous. But on this homogeneous network structure, you can actually have very heterogeneous patterns, like the all the patterns we showed before. That's kind of interesting. And yeah, thank you for your attention. And this is basically the two publications we have worked last year. So the first one on the random network has been published last year on Nature Communication, and the second spatial one is still under review. And thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd like to get. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, maybe it's stupid, but how does this relate, or does this relate to, like, you know, this like Turing pattern models?
Yeah, I don't know actually, because I'm not really familiar with the Turing pattern. But here the pattern is given by this network connectivity, because the active pattern are the result of percolation. So which means the patterns here are only related to network connectivity. But I think in Turing pattern is somewhat different. I don't know that very well.
Yeah, no, I was kind of hoping that you would tell me, because I'm a bit fried right now and I don't really remember like how they emerge in this model. But because yeah, like your octopus patterns,
Yeah,
in
exactly.
particular,
So
they have like this kind of like same, like similar stuff. Okay, then maybe like the most obvious question is the one you put at the end of your previous slide, which is like you're talking about potential applications in neuroscience. Do you have any ideas?
So there are quite a few things that I can say. So first of all, I think the not very perfect side of this model is we consider percolation. And I don't know this very well. I want to hear your opinion that I feel the percolation, the assumption of using percolation is not make that much sense in the brain network, in the sense that you can't say only nodes in the giant component are active. They're not. If they're not, they're immediately dies or immediately fails. So this is quite a brutal approximation. And actually, the other one is when we use percolation, we kind of assume that, as I said, we assume the percolating cluster is a result of some spreading process, ellipse or whatever. So there's a differentiation of the time scale of regulation and the dynamic. And I'm not sure if this is a good assumption or not. And indeed, there are some things have been done related to this triadic interaction. Actually, I can show you. There's a slide I prepared, but I didn't show, which is the relevant work. So the second one, that people trying to infer the triadic interaction from data. They use some kind of mutual information or something. So they try to find the activity of one node and the activity of another two nodes, if they are related or not, or how strongly they are related. So this is work been published, I think, this year. No, exactly this year. They try to infer the triadic interaction from actual data. And if we can get a reliable inference from the actual data, we might able to, let's see, do the simulation on this network that's based on actual brain network. And then potentially we can see if the spatial patterns or even this category of patterns somewhat make sense, or if in the actual brain you can observe anything related or similar to that. So this is one possibility that I can think of, and yeah, but I believe in actual brain is way more complicated than that. So I don't know. I hope you can tell me how to proceed.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is at the start when you defined this, that you said that you can have three order connections, but you're saying you can have four order connections and higher. Did you ever look at that?
Yes. So basically, the special part is you have a regulation from a node to a link. And previously, basically, all the interaction, even the high order ones, are between nodes. So naturally, you can consider a hypergraph model that the node is regulating a hyperedge that involves multiple nodes rather than a pairwise connection. And actually, I've been doing this, and the paper is almost finished. So we consider the similar structure, but on a hypergraph. So the result I show is like a special scenario in that framework. So yes, this can be done quite easily. So yeah, you can encode, and you can define this. You can call it hierarchical regulation, meaning that the regulation can also be regulated. And actually, this is considered or showed in this figure in this ecological network. They call it four-way interaction. So clearly, you see this kind of C. This 3 is regulating 1, 2, and the 4 is regulating the regulation between 3 and 1, 2. So you can define this kind of hierarchical structure. So you can, a lot of things you can define on the top of this, but it's just how the result can be different or how strong your motivation is to discuss. But yes, we are doing this in the new work. Yeah.
And my second question is that isn't the Triadic network just a special case of a directed hypergraph? Because a directed hypergraph has a hyperedge where you have the source vertices and the sink vertices. Essentially here you have an edge that goes from a vertex to 2 other vertices, so that's just a directed hyperedge.
Maybe, and I never studied the directed hypergraph myself, but it's more like how this framework can help you to let's say to solve this problem. For example, in this framework, we can tune how this regulation are constructed. For example, the density, how it's related to distance, or etc. So you can very easily control it, because you can consider this regulation is on the top of the structure network, so you can tune it as you wish. And I don't know if this directed hypergraph will also give you the same flexibility, but if yes, then no problem.
So I think that it'd be equivalent, but the reason I suggested is that there's a wealth of information known about hypergraphs, right? Lots of people have looked at them, there are many results that are known about them. So if you consider this in the hypergraph setting, perhaps you can apply some of these known results to this.
Okay, I mean, if you know, because previously I do this dynamical hypergraph, but it's undirected random hypergraph. So I don't know much about directed ones. If you know something, you can send me, that would be great. Thank you.
So if there is no other question, maybe you can thank Hanlin again.
Thank you.